Steve Kaufman here. It's a bit of a miserable day here in Vancouver. It's cloudy and overcast, and I have a cold, so don't be surprised if I break out into a cough here. But I thought I would follow up my recent videos where I talked about frustrations that we sometimes feel in language learning and talk a little bit about how do we know if we're progressing in a language. I want to talk about that subject, and then if I have time, or maybe in a subsequent video, I'll answer a question that I received from a teacher, an English teacher in Japan, who asked me, given that the role of the teacher is to motivate, primarily to motivate the student, and given that there are so many resources available today, just what should be the role of a teacher in a classroom? Now, I'm going to offer my opinions on that, probably in the next video, based on never having been a teacher in a classroom, but based on my experience as a learner, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. But before we get to that, let's talk about this business of how do we know if we're making progress? First of all, the simple answer is we know. I know when I'm able to say more things or when I understand more in a language. The problem is that the improvement is so slow that often we go for long stretches without feeling that we've made any progress. So what should we do? And I mentioned in one of my previous videos about these sort of technical terms that are used in the second language acquisition industry, terms like interlanguage, which say that as you are learning another language, you will obviously be influenced by your native language, and therefore you will continue to produce patterns or even pronunciation or use words or sayings that come from your native language, and that this will influence you when you speak another language. And I made the point that of course that's true. And I know many people, for example, who speak English very well, in particular Swedes who are very good at English, and they will always use certain Swedish constructions. Like instead of saying, there are many people in China, they'll say, it is many people in China. That's a very Swedish construction. And they'll, their S's or we were listening with my wife to a Swedish commentator on a golf program, and you can tell that she's Swedish. She is influenced by her native language in use of words, in structure, in pronunciation. But to me, that doesn't mean that she's speaking interlanguage. She is speaking English. And she is probably, well, at least the announcer, and the people that I know, I'm referring now to Swedish-speaking people who speak English very, very well. They don't need to get beyond that. They're already doing very, very well. If they wanted to focus on some of these expressions that are a little bit Swedish, they probably could get rid of them if they wanted to. Or maybe they can't. It really doesn't matter. They're very good at communicating in English. The problem is not when we get to that stage where we kind of let our shirt tails hang out every now and again as an Anglicism slips into our Russian or French or whatever. The problem is when we're starting out, and for a good long period, we have the feeling that we're forever unable to say what we want. We don't quite understand the movie. We don't quite understand what people are saying, and we sort of feel that we're not making any progress. And I referred to this earlier when I said, don't get frustrated, just focus on doing things that you enjoy doing. Okay, but then if we do focus on doing things that we enjoy doing, how do we know that we're making progress? Okay, to me, I like the word count. Now, I know that's quite controversial, and it's very much central to what we do at Link. But I know, for example, in Czech, I've been at it since August. My goal, by the way, when I start into a language is not immediately to speak it, because I think that's very difficult. And I'm not convinced that it's a good thing to try to do, because you may, in fact, if you spend a lot of time speaking improperly, you may ingrain those habits. And to me, language learning is about two things in a way. It's about repetition, and it's about stimulating the brain with new things. So you've got to have a mixture of repetition and a mixture of new, stimulating, interesting things. So you're mixing the two. But if you're doing too much repetition with a very narrow vocabulary base And with improper structure and improper pronunciation, that's what you're getting used to. That's what you're hearing. Similarly, if we sit in a classroom, say we're Japanese, and we sit in a classroom with other Japanese people who are learning English, most of the Japanese that we hear in the classroom is what the other non-native speakers are saying. So I'm not a great fan of that. I would far rather listen to a native speaker. I might have to just take this briefly and see who it is. Hello. Can I call you back? I'm in the middle of a video. You're in the office? Okay. Bye. Yeah. So brief interruption there. What I was saying was that, so I don't like being in a classroom because I'm hearing and I'm ingraining and I'm basically repeating a form of the language that I don't want. So we want to repeat and we want novelty. And to me, that's listening and reading. Okay? But how do I know that I'm getting anywhere? Well, I know because I've done it so often. I know, for example, in the case of my Russian, that as I listened more and more and as I read more and more, slowly I started to be able to speak better. And I then started to speak more and more. But what was my gauge that I was actually making progress? Well, that gauge is the number of words that I know. And that's why we make that the main metric at Link. Now, it's kind of like a leading indicator. You have to do a lot of other things. You can't study these words from word lists. You have to learn them through a lot of listening and reading. You also should save phrases. But the one easy thing to measure, the sort of Gordian knot, is the number of words you know. Now people are going to say, well, how do you know if you know them? You know them passively, you can't use them. I don't care. If I can understand them in a context, I'm happy. Because my goal is to understand. And I know that if I build up my ability to understand, that's a very solid base from which to start speaking. If your ability to speak gets ahead of your ability to understand, you'll be in for some difficult times because you'll say something and you won't understand what people say back to you. Now, in Czech, I've been at it since August. Link tells me that I know 20,000 words. I don't really know 20,000 words, but I know that 2 months ago I only knew, say, 10,000. So now I know 20,000. So I know with every day, as I'm continuing to work at it, I am increasing my vocabulary. And I also know, as I download texts from Czech newspapers on the web, that I understand more and more of it. That there's more and more of these words that, in fact, I do know, albeit passively. So, to me, a very good measure of whether or not we're progressing is this number of words that you know. Because it means that your comprehension is increasing. Whether, in fact, it's 20,000 or because Czech is a very inflected language, it equates to 5,000 words in English or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's not for bragging rights. It's in order to demonstrate to yourself that, in fact, you are continuing to progress. And if you continue to progress and your vocabulary, the words known number continues to increase, you will understand better and better. You'll read more material. As you're reading, you'll come across some of the words that you really know and some of them you more or less know, and you'll be constantly reading and exposing yourself to the language, and your comprehension will improve. And that, to me, is the number one thing. When you have a strong sense of ability to understand the language, then you start speaking. Now, there are people who say, well, I can read very well, but I can't speak. And I always ask them, I've had this discussion many times, and I say, oh, you read very well. So then, for example, are you comfortable reading a novel? Would you go and grab a novel? People say, immigrants in Canada say, I can't speak very well, but I read very well. We Chinese read very well. I often hear that. So with a group of, say, 50 Chinese people in a lecture once, I said, so how many people here willingly pick up a novel and read it, just like that, as something that they enjoy doing? Nobody. Well, to read well, you got to enjoy reading. It's not that you can pick your way through a short, article. You've got to be able to read books. And similarly with listening, do you enjoy audiobooks? Do you understand most of what's on the radio? This is where you got to get to in your comprehension. To do that, you need words. Because the biggest thing is, if you're missing a word, now I know we also want to learn phrases and so forth, but phrases are composed of words. If very often, and I know also that 80% of any context consists of the 2,000 most frequently used words, but it's the other 20% that determine the meaning. So measuring the words you know and having a way of staying on top of the fact that you are constantly increasing your vocabulary through these input-based activities, to my mind, is a good indicator that you are improving. And when you have a certain level of vocabulary, and I'm not there yet in my Czech. I'd like to have another 10,000 words and do a lot more listening, and then I'm going to start speaking more. I've spoken a couple of times. It's been very difficult, but I'm quite convinced that some other people who maybe start speaking earlier will be ahead of me. It's a bit of a sort of tortoise and hare situation. The hare will jump ahead of me. They'll be able to say more things in Czech very early, but in the long run, after 6 months, I'm convinced that I will be able to do more with my Czech in terms of reading, listening, having intelligent conversations with people on a variety of subjects. So there's a quickie then on, and that's a theme that I've talked about before, and that is, now I've got to find, where is it? There we are. I've got to find my cursor. Yeah, words. Keep up your word count, and you'll get there. That is as I've described before, it's basically the little mechanical rabbit at the dog race. It's something that keeps you going. So, thank you for listening. Oh, and I should add that obviously these words have to be gleaned through things that you enjoy doing. So, listening to music, if you like, and songs, or listening to audiobooks, or reading books or articles, but constantly pushing yourself a little further and further ahead and increasing your known word count. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.